Good evening. Welcome to Suffering in Silence with Tia May on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We're here every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay family, we're rising out of the ashes together. On this evening, our topic is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the Global Indigenous Council. We have with us for our guest co-host Bob Wood, who is the Title IX coordinator of Gwinnett Mercy University. And our guest for this evening is Rain of the Global Indigenous Council. Listeners, if you have questions or comments for our guest or our co-host, you can email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. If you have resources that you would like to share with us on a national or local level from your country, your community, local organizations, or your faith community, you can also email us at sufferinginsilencedv@gmail.com. Bob, I want to give you a few moments to introduce yourself to our listeners on this evening.
Yeah, good evening, and thank you very much for having me here. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you this evening, and with Rain, who I am very honored to be with. Rain very, very kindly let us screen somebody's daughter 2 years ago, and it was a big success on the campus, and very educational and eye-opening to a lot of people. As you said, the Title IX coordinator at Gwinnett Mercy University, and again, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
Awesome, thank you. Rain, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, hello to the Luv Bay community. It's our pleasure to be with you this evening or this afternoon or this morning, wherever you listen around the world.
Yes.
As Tia said, my name is Rain or Rashid in the Romani language. Ostensibly, I'm a filmmaker, as Bob alluded to, and I've made a movie called Somebody's Daughter. I did a second version called Somebody's Daughter 1492 until now, and one called Say Her Name. And all three of those focus on this topic of murdered and missing. I also have acted as the executive director of the Global Indigenous Council. And I presently have a book that's about to be published called Psychopathogen. So that's just a little bit about some of the activities I've been involved in recently.
Thank you so much. Where will your book be available?
Everywhere, I hope.
Right.
all good booksellers and all bad booksellers.
So
wherever.
When your book is published, we will absolutely share that information, and I will absolutely get a copy of it for myself.
All right, that sounds good.
So, listeners, as usual, we would like to start with sharing some resources. First, we have the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. Their website is www.niwrc.org. We also have Native Love. Their website is www.niwrc.org/Native Love. We also have Native Alliance Against Violence, Oklahoma's Tribal Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition, Tribal Technical Assistance Provider. Their website is oknaav.org. We also have the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Their website is www.thehotline.org. Their phone number is 1-800-799-7233. And we also have Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, also known as RAIN. Their website is www.rainn.org. Their phone number is 1-800-656-4673. So now, listeners, as we turn to our topic on tonight, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the Global Indigenous Council. Rain, can you please tell us about the Global Indigenous Council, and in what ways are you helping to raise awareness and educate on missing and murdered Indigenous women?
Well, the Global Indigenous Council was formed by a resolution of the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association in 2017. And the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association is an organization that represents every tribe in South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska. And it was a very important initiative when it came about, because what the Global Indigenous Council seeks to do is to provide unity and to provide voice for tribal nations and tribal communities around the world, because many issues that confront tribal people, whether it be within in North America, South America, Central America, in Europe, Africa, Australia, we can keep on going relative to the continents and the countries. Many of the issues have commonality, and they are similar, and they are rooted in the same causes. So the cause and effect that people are confronting is oftentimes the same, ostensibly. And so the Global Indigenous Council sought to provide voice to those communities. And there are many communities, tribal communities across the world, who do not have a platform by which their voices can be heard and their issues can be disseminated to a wider audience. And when I say a wider audience, I don't just mean the general public, I mean in a political forum as well. So attention can be brought to those. So that was really the purpose of the Global Indigenous Council, and I have had the privilege of serving as its executive director since its inception. With my own kind of personal career arc, I'm transitioning out of that role because, I have other things that I want to be doing creatively, particularly in the area of filmmaking. But that is a brief summary, at least, of what the Global Indigenous Council does and stands for. And so, in a typical week, we will receive emails from tribal communities in Australia, tribal communities on the continent of Africa, tribal communities in North America, and also tribal communities in Europe. So it is quite well known, and the word is continuing to spread. And, it's very heartening and very positive that there really is a desire for unity amongst tribal communities today, whereas, the dominant society, the Western society, spends most of its time trying to keep everybody siloed. And so, if there's an issue, they want to compartmentalize an issue. They don't want people to see the connection between all of these various issues, that there is a strand and there is a thread that connects them all. And similarly, I think with tribal communities, it's that way. They have always sought to separate tribal communities from one another, and people will be familiar with that term, divide and conquer, which has been very successful in the prosecution of colonialism. And so the Global Indigenous Council has sought to dismantle that and make this whole notion of divide and conquer be something of the past, to be a colonial relic, as it were. So far as the murdered and missing issue, the Global Indigenous Council has really been at the forefront of trying to seek federal recognition in the United States and the passage of meaningful federal legislation to be able to address what is an existential threat to tribal communities in the United States, in Canada, and also around the world, as I was just alluding to. And so that has been, one of the major strands of the work of the Global Indigenous Council. And the Global Indigenous Council was also one of the producers, the impact producer of Somebody's Daughter and Somebody's Daughter 1492, and also had a production role in Say Her Name, which was the other film that I wrote and directed on the murdered and missing crisis.
Wow. Well, I learned something on this evening. When I think of, before a few minutes ago, whenever I thought of tribal communities, I always thought about America and Canada. I never thought about Australia and Europe and Africa with tribal communities, never. So you just enlightened me. Thank you very much.
I think that is tears because, people's voices have largely been silenced.
Yes.
They don't have a platform. They don't have a forum. And so I can relay statistics to you that are from the murdered and missing crisis within the boundaries of the United States and that are impacting tribal communities in the United States. Similarly, I could do that with Canada. But the reality is that, for example, the Roma community, the Romani people, the Romani tribes in Europe are facing exactly the same thing, and the statistics will be very similar. We can go to Aboriginal communities, First Nations communities in Australia, and you're going to find the same thing. What the drivers are of this crisis. Similarly, you go down into South America, for example. There's a commonality between what's happening here in North America, what is happening in South America, what is happening in Australia, what is happening with tribal communities in Africa. And one of those common strands and common motivators of this crisis is extractive industry. And there is a direct correlation between the rape and destruction of our mother, the earth, and the rape and murder of Indigenous women. As we're having this conversation now, it is happening around the world.
Wow. Can you tell us what are some of the reasons for voices of tribal communities not being heard around the globe? Is it political reasons? Is it technology or financial? Like what are some of the reasons that voices are being silenced, that you had to create the Global Indigenous Council to give unity and voice?
Well, colonialism has had centuries to take hold and centuries to create these circumstances whereby the first peoples, the tribal communities, have become stigmatized and marginalized. And when communities are stigmatized and marginalized, they become extremely vulnerable, not just in the socioeconomic context, but they've had to endure centuries of attempts to assimilate them. So, for example, in the United States, the boarding school system is one example. In Canada, the residential school system. And you're seeing now in Canada how many mass graves being discovered at these residential schools, and that there had been attempts to cover up this barbarity and this brutality that was inflicted on tribal peoples. And so wherever you go, you're going to find wherever there was the colonizer, there are similar processes and similar tactics were used to dispossess tribal peoples of their land, to dispossess tribal peoples of their identities, and to dispossess tribal peoples of their heritages, and today to continue to dispossess tribal people of what in a Western term are called resources. But in actual fact, as one of my aunts, Casey Camp Haranek, says, take that RE of resources because they are sources of life that are being mined, that are providing for fossil fuels and so on and so forth. So, those are the reasons a lot of times why tribal communities are silenced, and tribal communities, because they have been marginalized, they don't have the political capital, because tribal communities are kept outside of the dominant society's political systems. And therefore, it's very hard for voices to be heard and for community members to break through within that particular system that exists. And then you have another dimension to this, which is that if you're a tribal member and you are desperately trying to retain your own culture, your own heritage, your own systems of governance, then in order for you to participate in the dominant society's system of governance, that takes an incredible compromise, because you run the risk of losing your own identity or having to compromise your own people's identities and values in order to participate in the dominant society's system that is essentially dictating to you how it is that you're going to live and how it is that you conduct your daily lives. And let's be perfectly frank about this. We can say living, but a lot of times for people in tribal communities, we're talking about existence. We're talking about day-to-day survival. And existence and survival is not living. Yeah. And so you could go in the United States. Let's use the United States as an example. You could go to the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. You could go to the Northern Cheyenne Indian Reservation. You could go to the Blackfeet Nation. And what you would see are third world conditions in the heart of the most affluent nation in the world.
If I may, I will just interject with what you just said. This year I had the privilege to go to Pine Ridge and do some work cutting wood to help people. And what you said is very true. And I was with a group there called the TP Raisers that works with the people from Pine Ridge, the Lakota people. And the gentleman on whose property we were cutting and stacking the wood gave every piece of wood to the people on Pine Ridge. And his last statement was, this is their only source of heat.
Wow.
So that is 100% accurate, and seen it with my own eyes. And as you said, the richest nation in the world, and that's the poorest county in the country, and it's a shame. It's a shame.
Well,
Go ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy, back in 1963, I believe this was, in Bismarck, North Dakota, he referred to the treatment that was endured and imposed upon tribal people in the United States as a national tragedy and a national disgrace. It is still that way today. So every time that there is a national political campaign, whether it be for United States Congress, United States Senate, or President, you will see lip service paid in contemporary times to tribal people. And the only times the tribal issues emerge and receive any coverage is when politicians require the tribal vote in some of the states where the demographics are changing. And so you've got, like, instead of red and blue states, you've got purple states. And this is happening more in the western states. And then there'll be lip service paid to tribal issues. And, this is going to change, and that's going to change. And we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. And we're going to do the next thing. And then after the election occurs, very little happens. And so what you get is an incremental approach to absolutely critical issues that an incremental approach is never going to change, is never going to alter, and is never going to affect. And so, we have to have an awareness of that. I mean, at least today, when politicians go on certain news channels, such as MSNBC, when they are listing off minority communities, they will mention Indigenous people. And that's something that's relatively new. Mm-hmm. But, there's a war going on right now in the Ukraine. Now, if you recall back to the Iraq war, the Afghanistan war, how many times did you hear the areas such as Fallujah? Fallujah was consistently referred to as quote unquote Indian country on the national news. When somebody engages in a political act that does not reflect the consensus of the party, you will see today Anderson Cooper or whoever will say, oh, that person's gone off the reservation. People don't even think about the racist context of what that is.
Yes.
Or how fundamentally ingrained systemic and institutionalized racism is. And there are so many words and phrases that are used in the national media that have their roots in that cesspool. So myself, as a person who identifies as Roma or Romani, you find that throughout. There are so many words and phrases that are derogatory, that are used essentially against us, and that continue to stigmatize and marginalize. And so, to one of your earlier questions here is that, how can people aren't heard? Well, if people become regarded as just a compendium or stereotypes, then ultimately the people themselves become invisible to the populace.
Right.
Because they are only known by stereotypes. They are not known by their own identities. They are not known by their own heritage. They are not known by their own culture. And every single day in mass media, it is contributive to that, because people simply do not pay attention and they are ignorant to a large degree, and they frankly don't care.
Yes.
How, may I ask then, earlier this year, I did a display at the school and I brought information in about what had occurred at the residential schools. And what you just touched on happened at my school. So many people came by what I had put up on a prayer tree and information, and they said, I did not know this was happening. I never knew this happened. I did not, I know it's not in the history books. We know that. How, and many people do not understand the impact of intergenerational trauma that comes down from this. How do we educate? Do we bring this forward to make visible the people that need to be made visible?
Well, I think it's actually, for the moment, it's going to be even harder, because you can see at the state legislative level some of the bills that have been passed to reinforce the whitewashing, and I use that term intentionally, the whitewashing of history. So when you have got all this absurd outrage about critical race theory, and people don't even know what critical race theory actually is, and you have got school boards whom are wanting to ban books that tell at least marginally the perspective of peoples of color and stigmatized and marginalized people, then it makes our task, and when I say our, I mean our collective task, all those folks who are of like heart and like mind, who wish to acknowledge and embrace our common humanity and understand that, there's more that unites us than divides us. It makes our task more difficult, but we have to persevere with that. And the only way that we can persevere with that is to continue to have conversations like this. And, for the Luv Bay community, for example, to continue this conversation that we are having. And, it's can continue in people's homes. It can continue in people's gathering places. It can continue wherever it is that folks come together. And that's how it is that, we have to understand that we cannot fall into that trap that the dominant society consistently sets for us, which is to make us feel fundamentally powerless.
Right.
that as individuals, we can't do anything about it because this is just the way it is. And the odds are so stacked against us and they're insurmountable. Well, Rosa Parks went and sat on a seat on a bus that they told her she could not sit on.
Mm-hmm.
But then, John Lewis and the Freedom Riders, what Dr. King did, what Malcolm X did, and then we can go into, indigenous culture and select any number of leaders, Standing Bear amongst the Ponkers, who, litigated that he was a human being. So indigenous people here in the United States would be recognized as human beings. And we can go on and we can go on and we can go on. And these people need to be our inspirations.
Yes.
We talk about role models. Well, we have role models. Everybody, from a marginalized community has role models, and we need to follow that. And we do not and cannot accept what it is that's presented to us that we are powerless, because we are not. We are the power. We are the power, and our collective voices are the power, and our unity of thought and our unity of purpose is the power, and that's the change. Change isn't a slogan. It's not a political slogan. Change is a movement, and change is a movement that comes from within, and change is a movement of empowerment that enables us to go forward and to elevate, and that's what we need to do. If we want to change things, let's not sit around and think that we can't do anything. Let's not sit around and just, turn on the TV, become even more depressed, and then turn it off again.
Right.
Let's become inspired. Let's recognize who we are and what it is that we are capable of doing when we come together and we raise our voices. And that is what we must do.
Agreed.
Well, I thank you, Rain, very much for raising your voice and for all that you do when you speak and your documentaries, because I tell you, I do turn on the television, the news, and I turn it right back off and wonder why I ever, tried to watch it in the first place. But we do thank you for everything that it is that you are doing. And Luv Bay, we want to take a moment to welcome you again to Suffering in Silence with Tia May on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We're here every Friday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern with a replay on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay, we are rising out of the ashes together. I have a few more resources that I would like to share, and then Bob, I'll go to you for any questions or comments that you may have for Rain.
Sure.
We have Ontario Native Women's Association. Their website is www.onwa.ca. Their email address is onwa@onwa.ca. Their phone number is 1-800-667-0816. We also have Strong Hearts Native Helpline. Their website is strongheartshelpline.org. Their phone number is 1-844-762-8483. We also have the Canadian Women's Foundation. Their website is canadianwomen.org. Their phone number is 1-866-293-4483. Their email address is info@canadianwomen.org. We also have Polaris Project, National Human Traffic Hotline. Their number is 1-888-373-7888. You can also text the words Be Free, BEFREE. You can text those words to the number 233-733. And their website is www.polarisproject.org. That's POLARIS, polarisproject.org. And we also have House of the Moon Indigenous Women's Empowerment and Self-Defense Program. The website is houseofthemoon.org. And also Sovereign Bodies Institute. The website is sovereignbodies.org. Bob?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
If I may, as a Title IX coordinator, I'm constantly looking for legal updates and how it's going to impact what I do in my daily work. And in that is how I became involved with the MMIWG or MMIWR movement. And I don't think many people are aware, and Rain, if you can help me tie these pieces together, the Oliphant versus Suquamish decision of 78 that stated tribal courts have no jurisdiction over non-Indians. And then, as you said, we had the extraction industries coming in, like the Bakken fields in North Dakota and various areas like that. Can you speak to that, to the impact and how those two are intertwined?
Well, the Oliphant ruling was really devastating to tribal sovereignty. And so, if we're to seriously address at the federal level the murdered and missing Indigenous women and relatives crisis, there needs to be a congressional Oliphant case fix. Because ostensibly what, the Oliphant case ruling impacted was tribal jurisdiction over non-tribal members on tribal lands. And so it removed tribal courts' ability to be able to try non-tribal members on its land. And so basically, tribal victims have very little redress in tribal courts when it comes to offenses that are committed by non-tribal members. And so non-tribal members, will identify communities that are extremely vulnerable. Perpetrators will often go there and they know that they can offend pretty much with impunity because of this jurisdictional entanglement that Indian country per se is choked within. Because you have tribal jurisdiction, you have federal jurisdiction, you have state jurisdiction, you have city jurisdiction. And so when your people are being victimized, and yet you as a sovereign entity cannot prosecute and try the perpetrators, that is obviously a very, very, very serious obstacle. Now, in addition to Oliphant, what we really need to be looking at, if we are seriously going to address the murdered and missing crisis in Indian country, is there needs to be an effort to repeal or radically overhaul the Major Crimes Act. We still have in place in the United States on Indian reservations a 19th century paternalistic law that still dominates in the 21st century. And that law is more repressive now than when it was passed in 1885. And so the Major Crimes Act, it started out that there were 7 major crimes that were identified by the federal government that would be committed on an Indian reservation, and that those 7 major crimes then fell under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And so today, if one of those crimes is committed on a reservation, then, a tribal officer can respond to that, but a tribal officer does not have the jurisdiction to do anything about it. The tribal officer has to call a federal investigator. So that will be a Bureau of Indian Affairs criminal investigator. The Bureau of Indian Affairs criminal investigator may then call an agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, because that's the jurisdictional chain that exists. Now, when I say this law is more repressive today than it was when it was passed in 1885, when it was passed in 1885, it identified 7 major crimes that the federal government was going to have jurisdiction over. It's now up to something like 13 major crimes. Now, when you're talking in the context of murdered and missing, everybody is aware, I think, that time is the critical factor.
Yes.
So when somebody goes missing, the first 30 minutes, the first hour, the first 2 hours, the first 4 hours are absolutely crucial. When you start getting past the first 8 hours, the first 12 hours, and then you start getting into, 24 hours, 48 hours, when you go into that period, and crime statistics bear this out, when you get into that period between 24 and 48 hours, your chances of recovering somebody who is being abducted diminish dramatically. And what you then are going to be engaged in is a recovery operation, meaning to recover a body, not a person who has been abducted. So let me just point out and provide you with an example for this. On the Blackfeet Nation in Montana is about the size of the state of Rhode Island. There are two TWO BIA criminal investigators for the entire reservation.
Wow.
So when a crime occurs or a potential crime occurs or a person is reported missing, a tribal police officer may show up to it. Their hands are tied because of the Major Crimes Act. So they then have to call a BIA criminal investigator. The BIA criminal investigator will show up to the crime scene. The BIA criminal investigator, in most instances, will then contact the FBI. The FBI agent is not resident on the reservation, so they have to travel to the reservation if they are actually going to show up. Maybe they don't show up and they just want to listen to the report of the BIA criminal investigator. Now, as I have been explaining this to you, you can imagine how much time elapses. When time is critical,
Right.
you've got these delays. And this is how come perpetrators, whether they be, you're a common or garden, opportunistic, single sex offender come perpetrator, or whether they be engaged in organized crime and are engaged in human trafficking, why they target tribal communities. Because they are fully cognizant of all of the holes and the loopholes that exist within the system. And so they can perpetrate their crime, they can commit their crime, and they know they've got a head start when it comes to being able to avoid apprehension and subsequently prosecution. And so all of this needs to be addressed seriously. I'm not talking about lip service. I'm not talking about the President of the United States coming out and saying, well, this is an absolute priority of mine. Well, okay, it's an absolute priority of yours, and you passed an executive action about 60, 70, 80% of which I actually wrote when I worked on his Indigenous Policy Committee, but that's a whole other story. Mm-hmm. But there were very substantive things that were left out of that. And some of the fixes that are required can only occur at the congressional level. And it needs to happen. If we're serious about addressing this existential threat to tribal communities, and let's just call it like it is, this is a human rights tragedy.
Yes.
A human rights tragedy.
Absolutely.
Yes.
There has to be a seriousness of intent from congressional and Senate leaders. It has to happen. Otherwise, we're going to be having a show like this and a discussion like this, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, 10 years from now. Because, the reality is that in the United States, tribal women and girls are 2.5 times more likely to be victims of sexual assault when compared to the general population. 1 in 3 tribal women in the United States will be raped in their lifetimes. Tribal women are 10 times more likely to be the victims of homicide. In Canada and Australia, that's about 6 times more likely to be the victims of homicide than the general population. The U.S. Department of Justice reported that 86% of all sex crimes committed against tribal women are perpetrated by non-tribal men. 90% of pimps and human traffickers of tribal women are non-tribal people. And that's just, a tiny glimpse into the statistical reality. But whenever I mention statistics, I try to remind people that behind all of these statistics is a daughter, a mom, an aunt, a niece.
Yes.
These are these are relatives, these are loved ones who are loved, who are missed, and who are mourned. And to really put this, into context for the listeners, in 2016 alone, there were more MMIWR cases than U.S. fatalities in 15 years of war in Iraq.
Wow.
So consider that. You had 15 years of war in Iraq, and our military suffered less fatalities than there were MMIWR cases in 2016 alone.
Wow.
May I add to what you just said? I mean, I know from my own research, you may be going there, and we talked about the change that needs to occur at that federal level and the congressional level. Many people don't know the DOJ only logged 116 of those 6,000 cases.
Exactly. That's one of the major pitfalls presently when it comes to being able to address this issue. We have all that absolute jurisdictional entanglement and mess, which has to be straightened out. And we actually drafted a bill called the Reduce, Return, and Recover Act, which would be the most comprehensive piece of MMIWR legislation that the late, great John Lewis was going to introduce to Congress. Well, tragically, he was taken from us before he had the ability to introduce that. So those of us who are working on this issue, we are presently trying to find a new sponsor for that bill. We are trying to find somebody from the United States Congress who has the political courage to step forward and carry on the work that the late, great John Lewis began. And that bill would address that jurisdictional maze, that jurisdictional entanglement, which is absolutely critical to being able to make inroads into this tragedy. But in terms of data, there is no uniform system of data collection or cross-jurisdictional dissemination. And so miscategorization of tribal people on police and coroner's reports, is just another form of quote-unquote othering. And it happens all over. And this is despite the passage of Savannah's Act, which was supposed to be, the bill that was going to lead to greater data collection and greater dissemination of data in the spirit of, cross-jurisdictional cooperation. Well, I think most everybody who has an awareness of how law enforcement operates is aware that, you can recommend that law enforcement agencies will cooperate with each other. But the reality is that they don't, and they are reluctant to do so. So unless you have legislation that mandates cooperation and doesn't just recommend it, you're not going to change the status quo. It's simply not going to happen. And so this whole issue of data collection and dissemination is critical to be able to move forward and actually get some of these cases solved. The Sovereign Bodies Institute, for example, Anita Lucchesi, who runs that, has done tremendous work in this area. And the only reason we have a lot of the statistics that we have is because of the work of the Sovereign Bodies Institute. And so Anita would be somebody to discuss that with, because she is immersed in that work. But, when I talked about police and coroner's reports, I drafted an executive order that Governor John Bell Edwards in Louisiana signed into law last May. And one of the articles that we addressed in that executive order was the fact that there was no category in the state of Louisiana for tribal people. And of course, there are many tribal people in Louisiana. So, you kind of have white, black, Asian, or other. And so if you're trying to assess the magnitude of a human rights tragedy such as this, when you're not even collecting the data because it's like miscategorization, and tribal people are just referred to as quote unquote other, then how are you going to do it? I mean, we are at that level where, these are just fundamentals. These are things that are basic. But if you're not even being acknowledged as existing, you're just other, then we have a long way to go.
Agreed. I'm from Baltimore originally, and I know there was a Native American group in Baltimore you may be familiar with, the Lumbee Nation. Mm-hmm. I don't believe the federal government has recognized them as of yet. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, I think this whole notion of federal recognition as well. This is a whole other minefield.
Yes, sir.
A whole other discussion too. But I am familiar, and so we can have that discussion some other time. I think, but it may diffuse the focus of this discussion if we
right. No, I agree, but I just backing up what you said. How can you possibly move forward when you're not even being recognized? It's insane. It's insanity.
So, Rain, I do have a question for you, but could you please share first the contact information for Global Indigenous Council?
Yeah, very simple. It's globalindigenouscouncil.com or globalindigenouscouncil.org. I believe either will point to the website. And for information on the murdered, missing Indigenous women and relatives, human rights tragedy, people can go to somebodiesdaughter.com. And there they can find information not just on the movies, they can see the trailers, and there's also resource pages there to assist people with engagement.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So what I wanted to ask you earlier, you mentioned existence and survival, and that's not living, and I agree with you 100% in what you said. And so we advocate strongly for victims and survivors of domestic violence. What I wanted to ask is, could you speak to the issues that women have with access to police and access to medical facilities? Those things that maybe we would take for granted in the larger cities. But can you talk about how it really is an issue having access to the police department and to medical facilities?
Yeah, that's a huge problem that needs to be addressed, and it somewhat goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the fact that on many Indian reservations and many tribal nations, in the Rocky Mountain West and in the Southwest particularly, you're talking about third world conditions. And to put that into context, when we were talking about Pine Ridge Indian Reservation earlier, unemployment on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, is like 70, 80, 85%. Mm-hmm. But think about that. Yeah. Unemployment on the Northern Cheyenne Nation is, 50 to 60%, may even be higher than that. Unemployment on the Blackfeet Nation, very similar. So you have an absolute lack of any form of infrastructure. You've got no capacity to improve your socioeconomic condition because of the way that the Indian Reorganization Act was drafted, written, created, and imposed. upon many tribes. And so part of that leads to the perpetuation of the socio-economic deprivation, which also includes healthcare provision and healthcare facilities. So, for example, on the Northern Cheyenne reservation, have family members on the Northern Cheyenne reservation, the Strange Owls and the Shoulder Blades, and there isn't a hospital on the reservation. There's a clinic. So the people from Northern Cheyenne, they have to go to the neighboring reservation, which is the Crow Nation. And if they can't be accommodated there, then they're going to be going to Billings, Montana, to a hospital in Billings, Montana, which is over, 90 minutes away. And so there isn't the readily available access to those facilities and to those provisions that women need. And, I'm not just talking about in the context of if somebody is assaulted, that immediate response. I'm talking about the mental health care provisions. And when I mentioned the Reduce, Return, and Recover Act, we also address this very issue in that, including the mental health care aspect of that. So, that bill is absolutely critical to get introduced. I'm firmly of the belief that President Biden would sign it into law. It would pass the House as it stands. It would probably pass the Senate, amazingly enough, and would reach the president's desk. But we have to find somebody who's got sufficient political courage and who will basically do more than engage in lip service to get this bill onto the floor and have, Speaker Pelosi bring it up for a vote. I mean, this is what we need to address those things, because there is massive, massive, massive disparity that exists in this area. And, I don't want to sit here and disparage those folks who work in the Indian Health Service, but I think most anybody who you would bring on who has experience of the Indian Health Service, whether it be as a patient, whether it be as a community member, or whether it be as somebody who works within the Indian Health Service, would tell you all of the challenges that exist within the Indian Health Service. So the treatment that is available to people is not the same as in a regular city where you go and produce your Blue Cross Blue Shield card. Let's put it that way.
Oh, wow. Bob, you have a...
I'm again, Kami, I know through the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition, I could take in an advocacy course. And again, I'm more supportive than questioning. I was shocked to find out, again, as I deal in Title IX sexual assault, that a sexual assault victim, to get a sane examination, may have to travel 3 to 4 hours to get to the hospital where the examination can be done. And as you have so eloquently said, that needs to change immediately.
Well, I am continuing to learn myself. So again, Rain, I appreciate you for being here. I appreciate you, Bob, as well. We are just under the hour. So Rain, I want to give you the last few minutes that we have. Can you tell us what you have planned next in your awareness and advocating efforts, and then leave us with your last words that you would like for the listeners to know and understand?
Well, I'm going to focus, mostly on the issue as opposed to what it is that I'm doing as an individual. People need to recognize that the MMIW are a tragedy. It didn't start in the 1990s. It didn't start in the 2000s. It began in 1492. It began with the first recorded European contact with tribal people on this continent. I usually give this quote from Columbus, where he stated, 100 Castellanos are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. There are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand, and for all ages, a good price must be paid. That is a direct quote from Christopher Columbus. So that leaves very, very little doubt. So MMIW, it was authored in the doctrine of discovery. So it's now time for a doctrine of recovery. And that begins with a rejection of the patriarchal constructs that oppress, a dismantling of misogyny and its reign of terror, and in their place, reigniting the flame of the sisterhood. And that's what I was talking about at the outset with unity and what the purpose of the Global Indigenous Council was. You'll hear politicians all the time saying that MMIWR is an epidemic. It is not an epidemic. We are still living through a pandemic, so we know what an epidemic is. An epidemic is biological in nature, whereas MMIWR is a crisis of human origin rooted in centuries of colonialism. If we fail to grasp that and fail to understand that, we are not going to address it. Relative to what it is that we can do, the reality is that it takes all of us coming together and contributing to address a human rights tragedy of this magnitude. I talk all the time about forming a coalition of conscience. A coalition of conscience. We need to leave the MMA cage fights of social media. We need to drop the lateral violence, and we need to recognize, as I said earlier, how everything is connected. These issues are not compartmentalized. As I also said earlier, the rape and destruction of our mother, the earth, correlates directly to the rape and murder of tribal women, not just in this hemisphere, but worldwide. Extractive industry needs to be held accountable, and it needs to be recognized as the nitroglycerin to this tragedy. We're going to have a big movement here in the United States to engage in more drilling because of the price of gasoline and OPEC holding back supplies. And, we get somewhere between 2 and 10% of our energy resources from Russia, but this is going to be used as an excuse. This should be used as a motivator for renewable energy, not to further destroy the earth and not to further destroy tribal communities. My belief is that in the original dreams of tribal peoples, the sisterhood was at the heart of the tribe, the life givers, the reverence, the divinity of the feminine in each woman in those original dreams was seen in the earth, and in the earth was seen each woman. Each woman, irrespective of ethnicity, is a life giver, and as a life giver, possesses the inherent sovereign power and right to impact this human rights emergency that has gathered us here. We are witnessing within the MMIWR movement that our life givers are leading by example. Programs like the one you mentioned here, House of the Moon, formulated by Indigenous women for Indigenous women. And I would just remind people, as I alluded to earlier, that it's not about changing the world. It's about changing the parts of the world you touch. So collectively, let's reach out. I thank you for the invite to the show. I thank you, Bob, for your participation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Bob, you have a final word you'd like to share?
I would like to share something I have learned in Lakota, in my language, to you and to Rain. Lila Wopala. Many thanks for having me here tonight and for doing this. Lila Wopala.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Luv Bay, if you would like to catch up on previous episodes from the program, you can visit our YouTube channel, Suffering in Silence DV. Thank you for joining Suffering in Silence with TMA on Luv Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio. We are here every Friday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern. Luv Bay, we are rising out of the ashes together. Good evening.